Hi Saints, and welcome back to Supernatural by Design. My name is Jared, and this is part 2 of our Haman Eclipse. And if you haven't seen part 1, which will be useful for this particular video, I'll leave a link in the top right so you can check it out. But without further ado, let's just pick up where we left off. And so, coming back to our main topic slide, as we now have to discuss the 2 branches that stem out of the 3 Haman eclipses. One being tied to World War III, and the second being tied to the 7th anniversary of the Revelation 12 sign, which, interestingly enough, is tied to Esther. Fascinatingly enough. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let us now dive into our first branch in order to demonstrate how World War III is connected to our Haman eclipses. And I think you're really going to like this one here, because God has done something very fascinating connecting these Haman eclipses to World War III. So here, let's check this out. And so, turning to our Haman celestial signs. And so, boom, 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 big banner, World War III. History lesson here. Which one of these characters on the screen is tied to a world war? Well, if you guess the guy in the middle, then you are correct. Because one of the astonishing details about this particular Haman eclipse on 4/20/2023, as we saw in the last video, marked Hitler's birthday and was a part of the same sorrow cycle when Hitler came to power. And therefore, our Hitler-Haman connection is very much tied to World War II historically. And that's a key characteristic. And so, World War II. Coming back to our Haman celestial signs. And now, boom, ba boom, 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 another history question. What year did World War II start? Well, hold on. Let me riffle through some papers here. Here we go. World War II started in the year of 1939. And so, isn't it interesting then that the supreme leader of Iran was born the very year that World War II started? Isn't that incredible, Saints? Do you see the profound connection here? 2 of our 3 Haman eclipses are directly linked to World War II. In fact, that's a huge statistical improbability. Which begs the question, what does that tell us about our 4/8/2024 Haman eclipse? Well, let's come back to that and have us shift focus for just a moment so that we can build up some more evidence for our 4/8/2024 eclipse, Haman eclipse, and what it means. And so, turning to this slide. Why? Because this demonstrates a very unique pattern that God marked World War I and World War II with. You see, at the start of those wars, the planet Venus was in the constellation of Leo, both times. In fact, God did this very uniquely, in that Venus was the only planet in the same exact constellation at the start of both world wars. No other planet did that. God was being very precise here, very mathematical. In fact, did you know that God is a God of mathematics? He created it. How do we know that? We'll come back to this Venus and Leo world war pattern in just a moment. But check this out. Did you know that according to Job chapter 28, verses 24 through 26, it states this: For he looketh to the ends of the world, and seeth under the whole heaven, to make the weight for the winds, and he weigheth the waters by measure, when he made a decree for the rain, and a way for the lightning of the thunder. You see it? God is very mathematical. God created units for weight to describe mass when he created the winds, and then took those units and measured out the waters. He made a decree, a mathematical law for the rain, and a way for lightning, a mathematical equation for that. You see, God is very mathematical in the things that he created. Now you might be saying, well, that's great, Jared, but what does this have to do with World War III, let alone our Haman eclipses? Well, just bear with me. I promise we'll get there. Because if we come back to our Venus and Leo connection to World War I and World War II and pose this question, is God demonstrating a mathematical equation to World War I and World War II? Well, let's start a little more high level than that. Because if you and I wanted to formulate an equation about something, because we wanted to prove a correlation between two things, and we had a few data points to work with, we could then place those data points like right here, and we could draw a line in between them. And that line would represent a mathematical equation that we could use to predict something in the future in order to try to prove our conclusion, our theory. In fact, just in general, that's how scientific equations come about. And in our case, let's say our two data points is our Venus and Leo connections, suggesting that every time Venus goes into Leo, world wars break out. However, since Venus goes into Leo once a year, sometimes twice a year, world wars don't break out every year or twice a year. So are there any other constraints that could help us formulate an equation for when World War III would break out? Of course, if there is a pattern. And there is. Because in a previous video, we demonstrated what that constraint was. In fact, it was tied to Venus. In that, 3 years prior to when Venus would go into Leo, marking World War I and World War II, if Venus was in the constellation of Taurus at the moment of a solar eclipse, then 3 years later, when Venus would enter into Leo, world wars would break out. And so coming back to our Venus and Leo chart, we have a set condition. We only want to look at Venus and Leo for the start of world wars if 3 years previous, Venus was in the constellation of Taurus at the moment of a solar eclipse. Why? Because we want to prove that God has interwoven a mathematical equation using celestial signs to world wars, as that could help us to prove about what our 4/8 eclipse is connected to. And to that point, and coming back to our Taurus pattern, it turns out that on the summer solstice eclipse of 2020, Venus was in the constellation of Taurus. And therefore, 3 years from 2020, when Venus enters into Leo, will World War III break out? And to that point, and demonstrated in this video, the October war is coming, World War III, hoping that the rapture would take place at that moment. Although we now know it's tied when it goes nuclear, which we'll get to that here later. But the reason why we're looking at October of 2023, 3 years from our summer solstice eclipse of 2020, was because the month of October would be when Venus entered into Leo. And so, were there any wars that broke out in October of 2023? Yes, there was. In fact, predicted in that war is coming video, 8 days prior, war broke out in Israel. And not just any kind of war, saints. World War III. Saints, we're already in it. It just hasn't gone nuclear, which is the moment of the rapture, as we've demonstrated in other videos. But now, coming back to our equation, we start out with these two first data points marking World War I and World War II. And because the October 7th war took place when it did, proved the world war pattern. You see, isn't that fascinating? God's celestial signs have order to them. They're mathematical. In fact, just as we saw that Leo was very significant, and nearly a month out, there was another celestial sign that took place. Do you remember the comet Nishimaru? I think I just butchered that. Here, let's turn to Stellarium. Because if you notice, it became visible in the constellation of Leo. And a part that I missed was following through where this comet would proceed to be visible at, as it would ultimately stay visible until it reached the constellation of Virgo, which that constellation represents who? Israel. Do you see? God used Comet Nishimaru to point to war coming to Israel. Now, why am I bringing up this comet? Because isn't there a comet associated with our 4/8 eclipse? Yes. What do you think that's pointing to? Sorry, I don't want to get ahead of myself. But let's wrap this up. Our October 7th war, right, is part of the World War pattern. And if you recall in part 1, that attack has a connection being 7 days before the October 14th eclipse. And because Iran was just attacked 7 days before our 4/8 eclipse, matching the same characteristic of the October 7th war, do you see where this is going? Do you see where this is going? Even including the detail about God adding a comet to this eclipse coming up. In fact, to that point, let's double down on this. If we come back to our 3 Haman eclipses, and being that Ali Khamenei is the first, as we saw earlier, he was even born the very year that World War II started, on 4/19 of 1939. Well, because in a previous video, this one right here, the signs are repeating. Because saints, check this out. As the celestial signs leading up to World War II were repeating last year. And guess whose eclipse was a part of the World War II pattern? That's right, Ali Khamenei. Again, do you see where this is all going? Saints, we are already in World War III. We're already there. In fact, to that point, not only was Venus both in Leo at the start of World War I, but even the dates of the start of World War I and World War II shared a unique characteristic where they all added up to 68. And why is that important? Well, turn to this side. On the far left is phase 1 with the date connection. And the Ukraine invasion matched that same 68 date pattern as World War I and World War II. And this part of the phase is escalating right now. Right? We got Belarus, we got France, we got the UK, we got the US, we got Russia. Don't fall asleep on this one right here. On this part of the phase, this is escalating. And all of that is going on. And we have phase 2, connecting the celestial patterns of World War I and World War II, marking October 7th. And so here we are talking about wars and rumors of wars. Well, Jesus even tells us at the start of Daniel's 70th week, in Matthew chapter 24, verses 7 through 9, when nations rise against nations and kingdom against kingdom, that's called World War III. But let's back up for a second and add in verse 6, because Jesus even tells us, and you'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for these things must take place, and that is not yet the end. And so 2 things. First, we'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. We're there right now. Saints, that's called the build-up to the nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There's a build-up to World War III. We are in it. We're in it. But also it's important to note that because Jesus says this is not yet the end, in between those 2 verses, or in between those 2 statements, remember, he's also talking to a Jewish audience, so he's figuring in 7 years to account for Daniel's 70th week. Hence why when he states that World War III is the beginning of birth pains, then they'll hand you over to tribulation. That's Daniel's 70th week. And as a good reminder, how do we know that World War III, when it goes nuclear, is tied to the rapture? Well, as we see here, Jesus tells us that World War III marks the beginning of labor pains. Well, it turns out, when we look at the Greek word for birth pains, if we turn to this side, On the left, the Greek word for birth pains is Odin. Odin. And as you can see on the left, in yellow, it means the pain of childbirth, acute pain, severe agony, a snare. That's interesting. But notice on the right, I have highlighted in yellow Matthew 24, verse 8. That's when Jesus says the beginning of birth pains. But look at the bottom. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3. That's the same Greek word that Paul uses when talking about the sudden destruction that comes. Isn't that incredible? And to that point, and I hope demonstrated thoroughly enough, is that our 4/8 eclipse is connected to World War III. Why? Because we're already in it, saints. And we can demonstrate that mathematically and celestially. Not to mention, it's linked to Haman, who, as we know, is an archetype of the coming Antichrist. In fact, that he will rise out of this war, which makes sense for a peace covenant. Now, with that being said, that concludes our World War III branch of our 3 Haman eclipses. And now, in part 3, we're going to discuss how the 7th year anniversary of the Revelation 12 sign is connected to our 3 Haman eclipses. And so until next time, I love you, Jesus loves you, God bless, and Maranatha, King Jesus.